Hiroshima, August 6, 1945. The sky was clear, the streets alive with commuters, children and soldiers. Streetcars rattled on their tracks. Housewives haggled at markets. Schoolchildren marched in rows to demolish houses for firebreaks. At 8:15 a.m., a single silver bomber passed overhead. Few paid attention. Hiroshima had been spared the firebombing raids that devastated other cities. Some thought the Americans were saving it for occupation. Then, a flash. A blinding light tore across the city, brighter than the sun, hotter than the core of the earth. In an instant, the morning became white fire. Skin ignited. Shadows burned into walls. Buildings collapsed as if swept aside by an angry hand. The people of Hiroshima did not see a bomb. They saw a sun being born in the wrong sky. In the ruins, survivors staggered like ghosts, their skin peeling from their bodies, their eyes blinded. The river boiled as thousands jumped into it, desperate to escape flames. The city screamed, then fell silent. Hiroshima was gone. Back to the beginning. How had it come to this? How had ordinary people, schoolgirls, merchants, soldiers, mothers, become the first witnesses of the atomic age? The answer lay not in Hiroshima, nor in Washington, nor even in the skies above Japan. It began years earlier, in a laboratory in Berlin, where two German chemists split the nucleus of uranium and set loose a chain of discovery. From there, fear spread across Europe and America. Fear that Hitler might build a bomb first. Fear that the world's darkest war might unleash the world's darkest weapon. That fear sparked a race that would gather the brightest minds, the deepest secrets, and the greatest resources into a single project, the Manhattan Project. A project that would light the desert sky in New Mexico, and then consume the cities of Japan in fire. Chapter 1. The Spark of Fear. The story of the Manhattan Project does not begin with the clang of machinery, the heat of reactors, or the desert sands of New Mexico. It begins with fear. A spark of fear that flickered in European laboratories, in the corridors of power, and in the hearts of scientists who saw the world rushing toward catastrophe. It was the late 1930s. The shadow of Adolf Hitler's Third Reich stretched further across Europe each month. Nazi banners unfurled over Austria. Czechoslovakia had been devoured. War loomed inevitable. Yet what terrified physicists more than tanks and bombers was an invisible possibility, something buried deep within the atom itself. In December 1938, two German chemists, Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann, quietly announced a discovery in their Berlin laboratory. They had bombarded uranium with neutrons and observed something extraordinary. The uranium nucleus had split into two smaller nuclei. Nuclear fission. The unimaginable had happened. Word spread quickly through the scientific community. Lise Meitner, a physicist forced to flee Nazi Germany because of her Jewish heritage, worked with her nephew Otto Frisch to interpret Hahn and Strassmann's results. They realized that not only had uranium split, but that the process released vast amounts of energy, millions of times greater than any chemical reaction. For most scientists, this was a thrilling revelation about nature. But for others, especially those who had escaped Hitler's Europe, the discovery carried a sinister weight. If fission could be harnessed, it could unleash a weapon unlike anything the world had ever seen. Albert Einstein, living in exile in the United States, became one of the reluctant voices of warning. He was no weapons scientist, but his name carried influence. Together with fellow physicist Leo Szilard, a Hungarian refugee, he drafted a letter to President Franklin Roosevelt in August 1939. The letter warned of the terrifying possibility that Nazi Germany might develop an atomic bomb. The Einstein-Szilard letter marked a turning point. Until then, the idea of building a bomb from nuclear fission was a wild theory. But as the storm clouds of war gathered, the fear that Hitler's scientists might be racing toward this weapon gave the theory urgency. At first, Roosevelt's government reacted cautiously. The US was still not at war, and few believed that such a weapon could be built in time to matter. Funding trickled in, small research grants, scattered studies. It was a scientific curiosity, not yet a national priority. But fear has a way of spreading. Reports emerged of German advances in uranium research. Refugee scientists in America, men like Szilard, Edward Teller, and Eugene Wigner, knew their former colleagues in Europe were brilliant, and some were now working under Nazi command. Could Germany already be far ahead? Could Hitler one day hold in his hands a bomb powerful enough to obliterate a city? When war erupted in September 1939, fear intensified. Poland fell. France would soon crumble. Britain stood alone, under nightly bombardment. Across the Atlantic, Americans watched uneasily, wondering how long their country could remain out of the fight. By 1940, the whispers of atomic weapons began to echo louder in Washington. A small advisory group, the Uranium Committee, formed under the National Bureau of Standards. But progress was slow, funding meager. Scientists debated not only the feasibility but also the morality of building such a weapon. Some dreamed it could end war forever. Others feared it would unleash horrors too great to control. Still, the spark of fear continued to burn. In the laboratories of Columbia University in New York, physicist Enrico Fermi, another refugee, this time from Mussolini's Italy, joined Szilard to investigate chain reactions. If a self-sustaining chain reaction could be achieved, it would mean the door to a bomb was no longer locked. It would merely be a question of engineering. Meanwhile, across the ocean, Nazi scientists were indeed studying uranium. The intelligence was fragmented, but the possibility haunted Allied leaders. The fear that Hitler might strike first drove urgency. It did not matter that later evidence would show the German atomic program was disorganized, underfunded, and far behind. In those early years, the Allies assumed the worst. By late 1941, events would transform the United States' cautious curiosity into a full-blown race for survival. Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, dragging America into war. Suddenly, theoretical research became a national emergency. But before that massive mobilization, before generals and billions of dollars were involved, the Manhattan Project was only a fragile seed. It was a handful of scientists, letters, and committees, people who had glimpsed the terrifying potential of fission and could not shake the fear of what might happen if their enemies discovered it first. That was the spark. Fear of Hitler's bomb. Fear that science had revealed a power too great to ignore. Fear that inaction would leave the free world defenseless. And so the Manhattan Project was not born from ambition or greed, but from dread, a dread that the Nazis might unlock the atom before democracy did. This spark of fear would ignite one of the most secret, costly, and consequential projects in human history. Chapter 2. The Gathering Storm. When the United States first heard of nuclear fission, it was an intellectual curiosity, not a military priority. In late 1939, as war erupted in Europe, President Franklin D. Roosevelt cautiously authorized a small advisory body, the Uranium Committee. It was staffed with scientists and a handful of military men, given a budget so small that one physicist later joked it could barely buy lunch for the committee members. To Roosevelt, the idea of a superweapon was distant, abstract. America was not yet at war. Why invest millions of dollars in an experiment that might prove impossible? But events overseas were accelerating faster than Washington realized. Britain's wake-up call. Across the Atlantic, Britain faced nightly bombing raids, cities ablaze under the Blitz. The nation had far fewer resources than the US, yet its scientists were already ahead. In 1941, the British UD Committee delivered a chilling conclusion. Not only was an atomic bomb possible, it could be built within a few years. The report was sobering. It dismissed the notion that nuclear weapons were a distant fantasy. Instead, it warned, whoever built one first could determine the fate of the war. British scientists, recognizing their limits, urged the Americans to take the lead. Without US industry and funding, the project would stall. Pearl Harbor changes everything. Then came December 7, 1941. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor dragged the United States into a global conflict. Overnight, theoretical discussions turned into urgent demands. America was now fighting on two fronts, against both Germany and Japan. Every possible weapon was needed. Pearl Harbor was more than a military shock. It was a psychological one. The illusion of American distance from the war shattered. If Japan could strike Hawaii, what could Germany unleash from Europe? If the Nazis were closer to a bomb, delay could prove fatal. Roosevelt's decision. In 1942, Roosevelt took decisive action. The atomic project would no longer be a sideshow. It would become a top-secret, full-scale military program. The code name chosen was bland by design, the Manhattan Engineer District. Later shortened to the Manhattan Project, it sounded like any other Army Corps of Engineers assignment. In reality, it would become the largest secret operation in US history. But Roosevelt needed someone to lead it, someone who could cut through bureaucracy, command respect, and deliver results. Enter General Leslie Groves. The man chosen was hardly the image of a scientist. General Leslie Richard Groves was a career Army engineer, a stocky, brusque figure with little patience for hesitation. He had just overseen the construction of the Pentagon, then the largest office building in the world. Now he was handed a mission far more complex: to manage brilliant but unruly scientists, guard the tightest secrecy, and build an entirely new kind of weapon before the enemy did. Groves was skeptical at first. He worried the project might be an expensive wild goose chase. But once he understood the stakes, he threw himself into it with relentless energy. His style was authoritarian, sometimes abrasive, but effective. He demanded speed, results, and absolute secrecy. Oppenheimer, the unlikely leader. Groves's most surprising choice was for scientific director, J. Robert Oppenheimer. At the time, Oppenheimer was little known outside academia. A theoretical physicist at Berkeley, he had never managed a large project. Some doubted whether he was practical enough. But Oppenheimer had a rare combination of intellect and charisma. He could speak the languages of both mathematics and metaphors, inspiring colleagues with a sense of mission. Groves trusted his brilliance, and Oppenheimer rose to the challenge. Together, Groves and Oppenheimer formed an unlikely partnership, the hard-nosed general and the poetic physicist. One brought military discipline, the other scientific vision. Secrecy becomes policy. From the beginning, secrecy was absolute. Few Americans knew the project even existed. Congress was kept in the dark. Even Vice President Harry Truman was unaware until he became president in 1945. Compartmentalization became the rule. Scientists worked on fragments of the problem without knowing the whole picture. Workers at construction sites had no idea what they were building. Letters were censored. Families were separated by silence. This secrecy extended to espionage fears as well. German scientists were assumed to be racing toward the same goal, and Allied leaders dreaded the possibility of betrayal from within. The project became a fortress of information. The storm builds. By mid-1942, the pieces were in place. Roosevelt had authorized full funding. Groves commanded the military machine. Oppenheimer was gathering scientists. Sites were being scouted in Tennessee, Washington, and New Mexico. What began as a whisper of fear in European labs had grown into a storm of urgency. America was mobilizing not just soldiers, tanks, and ships, but the most brilliant minds of an entire generation. The race for the atomic bomb was no longer theoretical. It was real, and the clock was ticking. Chapter 3: Building the Invisible Army. The Manhattan Project is often remembered as a story of brilliant physicists scribbling equations on chalkboards, but the true heart of the project was far larger. It was not just about Oppenheimer, Fermi, or Szilard. It was about building a nationwide war machine, an invisible army of hundreds of thousands of workers, engineers, and soldiers, all laboring in silence, many without ever knowing what they were really building. The scale was staggering. Entire towns were erected out of nowhere. Factories the size of cities hummed with secret activity. Rivers were diverted, railroads laid, mountains hollowed out. It was the largest industrial construction project in history up to that point, and it had to be done in complete secrecy. The Manhattan Project was not only about splitting atoms, it was about splitting reality itself, creating a world where science, industry, and war fused into a single, unstoppable force. From science to industry. The scientific discovery of fission in 1938 was one thing. Turning that knowledge into a usable bomb was another. For a bomb, you needed fuel, either uranium-235, a rare isotope found in tiny amounts within natural uranium, or plutonium, an element that did not even exist in nature. Both were fiendishly difficult to obtain. Natural uranium is 99.3% U-238, a stable isotope that won't sustain a chain reaction. Only 0.7% is U-235, the explosive ingredient. To build a bomb, you needed kilograms of nearly pure U-235. Separating that fraction from tons of uranium was like sifting sand for a handful of golden grains, almost impossibly difficult. Plutonium offered another path. It could be manufactured inside nuclear reactors by bombarding uranium with neutrons. But such reactors had never been built on a large scale. Designing one meant entering uncharted territory. The scientific problem was solved on paper. The engineering problem was monumental. The Manhattan Project became less about physics and more about industry on a scale the world had never seen. Oak Ridge, Tennessee, the uranium city. The first challenge was uranium enrichment. In 1942, the U.S. Army acquired 59,000 acres of farmland in Tennessee, tucked near the Tennessee Valley Authority's hydroelectric dams, which could supply the enormous electricity demands. This became Oak Ridge, later nicknamed the Secret City. Almost overnight, Oak Ridge transformed from rural countryside into a sprawling industrial complex. At its peak, it housed 75,000 workers, making it the fifth largest city in Tennessee. Yet it was not marked on any map. Here, engineers tried every possible method to separate U-235 from U-238. Groves insisted on pursuing multiple paths at once, fearing any one method might fail: electromagnetic calatrons, gaseous diffusion plants, and thermal diffusion towers. The complexity was staggering. Entire factories larger than football stadiums were filled with machines that whined, roared, and clattered day and night. The workforce was mostly young women, recruited from across the South and Midwest. They operated calatrons like switchboards, carefully adjusting dials, unaware they were separating uranium atoms destined for a bomb. One such worker, Gladys Owens, posed for a photograph inside the Y-12 plant in 1945, smiling with friends. Only years later did she discover what she had been doing. "We didn't know until after the war," she recalled. "Nobody knew what we were doing. We just knew it was top secret." Life in Oak Ridge felt both ordinary and surreal. Residents lined up at mess halls, went to dances, and fell in love. Yet guards searched their mail, and neighbors who asked too many questions quietly disappeared. Workers joked that the only thing they were manufacturing was confusion. Hanford, Washington. The plutonium frontier. If Oak Ridge was a city of machines, Hanford, Washington became a city of reactors. In 1943, the Army seized 670 square miles of desert land along the Columbia River. Farming families were forced to leave with only weeks' notice. Native tribes, who had fished the river for generations, were displaced. Here rose the B reactor, the world's first full-scale plutonium production reactor. Its graphite core glowed faintly as uranium fuel rods churned out a new element, plutonium-239. The work was grueling and dangerous. Few understood radiation's long-term risks. Workers wore film badges to monitor exposure, but many complained of mysterious burns and illnesses. Some refused to drink the river water. Yet despite hardship, there was a sense of camaraderie. Families lived in hastily built prefabs. Children went to makeshift schools. Baseball games were played on dusty fields under the shadow of reactors. Hanford was both a frontier town and a place of constant anxiety. The plutonium produced here would one day fuel the Fat Man bomb. Most who lived and worked there had no idea. Los Alamos, New Mexico. The brain of the operation. While Oak Ridge and Hanford created the fuel, the brain of the Manhattan Project was located in a remote corner of New Mexico. Los Alamos was chosen for its isolation, a high desert mesa where a boys' boarding school once stood. Here, under Oppenheimer's leadership, scientists and their families lived behind barbed wire. Physicists calculated bomb designs by day and played string quartets by night. Children attended a school where even their textbooks were censored. Wives pushed baby strollers down dusty lanes under the watchful eyes of armed guards. There were moments of humanity amid secrecy. Oppenheimer held parties where Nobel Prize winners debated while sipping cocktails. Scientists' children built snowmen in winter, unaware their fathers were designing weapons of mass destruction. But life could also be claustrophobic. Wives complained of isolation and boredom, unable to leave or even tell relatives where they were. Letters were read by censors. Some compared it to a gilded prison. One Los Alamos wife later quipped, "We were the only town in America where you couldn't buy a telephone book. Ours was stamped top secret." Logistics and cost. Coordinating Oak Ridge, Hanford, and Los Alamos was a feat of engineering logistics. Uranium or came from mines in Africa and Canada, shipped under armed guard. Equipment had to be manufactured in pieces across multiple factories, so no single company could guess its purpose. By the end, the Manhattan Project employed more than 600,000 people. It cost nearly $2 billion at the time, about $30 billion in today's money. And yet, until Hiroshima, even Vice President Truman did not know of its existence. Engineering culture versus secrecy. The secrecy came at a price. Workers grew frustrated, following instructions without knowing why. Scientists resented military interference. Engineers chafed at theoretical debates. But Groves had a blunt philosophy. Don't wait for one method to fail before starting another. Do everything. It was wasteful, but it worked. By throwing resources at every possible path, the Manhattan Project advanced at breakneck speed. The Invisible Army. By 1944, the Invisible Army was fully in motion. From the Tennessee hills to the Washington desert to the New Mexico mesas, tens of thousands labored night and day. Trains carried uranium or under armed guard. Reactors churned out plutonium. Factories hissed, roared, and clattered. And yet, secrecy was so complete that most of those workers had no idea what they were building. Only when Hiroshima was destroyed in August 1945 did many finally understand the purpose of their toil. The Manhattan Project was not just a scientific triumph. It was an industrial miracle. A nation had built, in total secrecy, the infrastructure of the atomic age. It was the greatest engineering gamble in history, and it was about to pay off, in fire. Chapter 4: Secrets and Spies. If the Manhattan Project was a triumph of secrecy, it was also a story of secrets betrayed. For while the United States poured billions into protecting information, some of the most closely guarded knowledge in the world was leaking out, hand-carried by men who smiled at their colleagues by day and passed sketches to foreign handlers by night. It was a paradox, a project that demanded total secrecy yet depended on thousands of people working side by side. In such an environment, paranoia was inevitable. Scientists argued not only about physics but about morality. Military guards shadowed them. The FBI watched from the shadows. And all the while, Soviet spies quietly slipped into the heart of the atomic project. Paranoia in the secret cities. At Oak Ridge, Hanford, and Los Alamos, secrecy was absolute. Workers were forbidden to discuss their jobs, even with family. Mail was censored. Conversations were monitored. Posters warned, "What you see here, what you do here, what you hear here, when you leave here, let it stay here." Yet rumors spread. Some workers whispered that they were producing synthetic rubber, others that it was a miracle fuel. A few guessed correctly and were quickly silenced by military police. Paranoia grew. Workers who asked too many questions suddenly disappeared, transferred or dismissed without explanation. Families lived in fear of slipping up. One Los Alamos wife recalled, "You felt you had to watch every word you said, even to your own children." The secrecy bred tension, suspicion, and sometimes resentment. Many wondered, if the project was so important, why weren't they trusted with the truth? Scientists and morality. Inside Los Alamos, secrecy collided with conscience. Some scientists began to question what they were building. Would the bomb save lives by ending the war quickly, or unleash horrors humanity could never control? Physicist Leo Szilard, one of the first to warn Roosevelt of nuclear weapons, circulated a petition urging that Japan be warned before the bomb was used. Others argued for a demonstration on an uninhabited island. Oppenheimer listened but grew increasingly convinced the bomb had to be used in combat, to justify the immense effort and to prove its power beyond doubt. The debates were heated but always behind closed doors. Publicly, the scientists remained silent, but in their private journals and whispered conversations, a sense of dread grew. One young physicist later recalled, "We felt like we had made a deal with the devil. We didn't know if we were building peace or the end of the world." the Allies become rivals. Officially, the Soviet Union was America's ally in the war against Nazi Germany. Unofficially, US leaders were deeply suspicious of Joseph Stalin's ambitions. They knew that once Hitler was defeated, the Soviets would become the next geopolitical rival. Stalin, for his part, was determined not to be left behind in the atomic race. His intelligence services, the NKVD, set up networks of spies across the United States and Britain, seeking any scrap of information about the bomb. And they succeeded. Klaus Fuchs, the perfect spy. Perhaps the most damaging spy within the Manhattan Project was Klaus Fuchs, a German-born physicist who had fled Nazi persecution and found refuge in Britain. Brilliant and unassuming, Fuchs joined the British atomic program and later transferred to Los Alamos, where he worked on crucial implosion calculations. Unknown to his colleagues, Fuchs was also a committed communist. Believing that the bomb should not be monopolized by any single power, he passed detailed reports of Los Alamos designs to Soviet handlers. His information helped Moscow leapfrog years of research. Colleagues remembered Fuchs as polite, diligent, and utterly ordinary. No one suspected that, while they debated equations, he was memorizing blueprints for Stalin's scientists. Theodore Hall and other leaks. Fuchs was not alone. A 19-year-old prodigy at Los Alamos, Theodore Hall, also fed secrets to the Soviets, convinced that sharing nuclear knowledge would prevent American domination of the post-war world. Others, like David Greenglass and Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, would later be implicated in passing nuclear information. The FBI and Army intelligence chased leads, but the sheer size of the project made total control impossible. The more people involved, the more doors spies could slip through. Human cost of suspicion. The paranoia wasn't just about Soviet spies. Even loyal Americans felt its weight. Scientists were subjected to background checks, their political affiliations scrutinized. A few were barred from sensitive work because of past ties to leftist organizations. At Los Alamos, one physicist joked bitterly, "If you ever attended a book club, better hope it wasn't Marx." Wives complained about their husbands being interrogated. Families lived under the shadow of suspicion. Some careers were ruined not by espionage but by rumor. Oppenheimer's dilemma. At the center of it all was Robert Oppenheimer. Brilliant, eloquent, and charismatic, he held Los Alamos together. Yet his own past, friendships with communists, leftist sympathies in the 1930s, would later come back to haunt him. For now, Oppenheimer kept his doubts private. He inspired his team with a vision that their work would end the war and save countless lives. But in private moments, he confessed unease. In the debate on the military use of the bomb, he once admitted, the voice of the scientist is but one of the voices. He had become both architect and prisoner of the project, torn between pride in its brilliance and fear of its consequences. The shadow of Germany. Even as spies leaked secrets, the driving fear remained Nazi Germany. Allied leaders did not know that the German atomic program was fragmented and underfunded. To them, the danger felt urgent. What if Hitler's scientists were only months away from a bomb? This fear justified the pressure, the secrecy, the endless pace. Scientists at Los Alamos worked long into the night, fueled by both ambition and dread. Some admitted they slept only a few hours, haunted by the thought that Germany might strike first. When Germany finally surrendered in May 1945, some scientists wondered aloud, should the project continue? Was the bomb still necessary? But by then, momentum had its own logic. Billions had been spent. Factories were humming. A weapon was nearly ready. And Japan was still fighting. The dual edge of secrecy. By mid-1945, the Manhattan Project had achieved the impossible. It had kept one of the largest industrial programs in history largely hidden from the public. Yet secrecy had its cracks. Stalin already knew more about the bomb than Vice President Truman. Workers across Oak Ridge and Hanford guessed in whispers what they were building. And inside Los Alamos, scientists debated the morality of unleashing what they had created, even as spies carried their secrets across oceans. The invisible army was about to deliver its weapon. But the secrecy that had protected it also guaranteed a world where no nation would hold the monopoly for long. Chapter 5. Trinity. The Day the Sun Exploded. The desert was quiet. It was July 16, 1945, 5:29 in the morning. In the Jornada del Muerto, Journey of the Dead Man, Valley of New Mexico, the world stood on the edge of something it had never seen before. Men in bunkers, scientists in trenches, generals pacing behind barbed wire, all waiting. In the pre-dawn darkness, a steel tower loomed 100 feet high. At its top sat a strange metal sphere, covered in wires and cables, nicknamed the Gadget. Inside, the first plutonium bomb ever built. 4 years, the Manhattan Project had been theory, factories, equations, and secrecy. But now it came down to this moment. Would the bomb work? Would it fizzle into nothing? Or would it ignite something far worse? Final preparations. The night before had been tense. Rain pounded the desert. Lightning threatened to strike the tower itself. If the test failed because of weather, weeks of preparation would be wasted. Some feared they would have to dismantle the bomb and try again. At 2 a.m., the rain finally eased. Technicians scrambled to complete wiring. Explosives experts checked their circuits for the 100th time. Oppenheimer, thin and chain-smoking, moved among them, speaking softly. He looked exhausted. He hadn't slept. Few had. Some joked nervously. Others sat in silence. Enrico Fermi, always the prankster, proposed a betting pool. He asked colleagues what odds they gave that the bomb would destroy the entire state, or ignite the atmosphere. It was a joke. Mostly. But even Oppenheimer admitted the risk had crossed his mind. One scientist scribbled in his notebook, "It is not only our own lives we risk today, but the future of mankind." The waiting. At 4 a.m., hundreds of men took positions miles from the tower. Some crouched in slit trenches, others sheltered in bunkers. General Leslie Groves stood with binoculars, a commanding presence despite his nerves. The countdown was supposed to end at 4 o'clock, but the storm delayed everything. They waited in the damp silence, watching the tower through the gloom. At 5:10, the loudspeakers crackled. 20 minutes to 0. The men adjusted welders' goggles over their eyes. Others turned their backs, afraid to watch directly. Some lay flat in the dirt, faces pressed to the desert floor. Oppenheimer stood quietly in the bunker, his face pale, eyes fixed on the horizon. The countdown. At 5 hours 29 minutes and 45 seconds, the voice came over the radio. 10. Hearts pounded. 9. Breath held. 8. Hands clenched into fists. 7. The desert was silent. 6. Time slowed. 5. This was it. 4. No turning back. 3. The tower stood black against the horizon. 2. The world held its breath. 1. The flash. At 5 hours 29 minutes and 45 seconds, the darkness exploded. A blinding light brighter than the sun split the desert sky. For an instant, it was as if a second dawn had come. Men miles away saw their bones illuminated through their skin, like X-rays. The desert floor glowed white, then red, then orange. Then came the heat, a scorching wave, even from 10 miles away. Eyebrows singed, skin prickled as if near a furnace. And then, seconds later, the shock wave. A deafening roar rolled across the valley, echoing off the mountains, rattling windows 100 miles away. The earth shook as if struck by a giant's fist. Above the desert rose a vast mushroom cloud, boiling and climbing into the stratosphere. Colors shifted, purple, orange, gray, as the fireball churned and twisted. Reactions. For a long moment, there was silence. General Groves broke it with a grim nod. Well, it worked. Enrico Fermi, true to his style, scattered scraps of paper into the blast's wind to measure the force. He calmly calculated the bomb's yield, 20,000 tons of TNT. He was right. Some men cheered. Others wept. A few simply stared, unable to speak. Kenneth Bainbridge, who directed the test, turned to Oppenheimer and muttered, "Now we are all sons of bitches." Oppenheimer himself said nothing. In the days to come, he would recall a line from the Bhagavad Gita. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." The world changes. In that instant, everything changed. The Manhattan Project had worked. The invisible army of scientists, engineers, and workers had achieved the impossible. The United States now held a weapon of unimaginable power. But the explosion over the Jornada del Muerto Valley was not the end. It was the beginning. Within weeks, 2 bombs would fall on Japan. Within years, the Soviet Union would have its own. Within decades, humanity would live under the shadow of nuclear annihilation. But on that July morning in 1945, the men at Trinity were not thinking of geopolitics or Cold War strategies. They were staring at a fireball that turned night into day, realizing they had opened the door to a new age, and there would be no way to close it again. Chapter 6. Hiroshima and Nagasaki. On the morning of August 6, 1945, the people of Hiroshima awoke to another day of war. The air raid sirens had become routine. Planes had flown over before, dropping firebombs on Tokyo, Osaka, and other cities. But Hiroshima, a military hub with factories and soldiers, had been largely spared. Many thought their city was safe. Shops opened. Schoolchildren walked in groups, some assigned to demolish wooden houses to create firebreaks. Commuters boarded trams. Housewives prepared breakfast. The morning was warm, the skies clear. Few could have imagined that by midday their city would be gone. The bombers approach. At 8:15 a.m., a Silver B-29 bomber named Enola Gay flew high over the city. Inside its bomb bay rested a single weapon, Little Boy, a uranium bomb unlike anything ever used before. The bomb bay doors opened. A cylinder fell silently, parachute-free, through the clear sky. It took 44 seconds to descend. On the ground, some pointed upward at the glinting object. Children playing in schoolyards paused to watch it fall. At 1,900 feet above the city, the bomb exploded. Hiroshima. In an instant, Hiroshima ceased to exist as it had been. A blinding flash brighter than the sun illuminated the city. Anyone in the open was seared by heat that reached thousands of degrees. Shadows of people were burned into stone steps. Birds burst into flames in midair. A split second later, the shock wave ripped through the city. Wooden houses disintegrated. Roof tiles flew like shrapnel. Entire streets vanished in a hurricane of fire and debris. A fireball half a mile wide rose into the sky, sucking oxygen from the ground. The blast flattened two-thirds of the city in seconds. An estimated 70,000 people were killed instantly. Tens of thousands more would die in the days and weeks to come. Eyewitnesses. Survivor accounts capture the horror. A young schoolgirl recalled seeing classmates vanish in the flash. When I looked back, they were gone. Just gone. A doctor described the injured staggering through the streets, their skin hanging in strips, eyes burned blind. A soldier recalled, people's bodies were swollen and blistered. They begged for water, but when they drank, they died instantly. In the river that ran through the city, thousands jumped in to escape the flames. The water boiled from the heat. Everywhere was fire. The city became a hellscape of screams, smoke, and silence. Nagasaki. 3 days later, on August 9, 1945, it happened again. The target was originally Kokura, but clouds obscured the city. The bomber diverted to its secondary target, Nagasaki, an industrial port. At 11:02 a.m., the Fat Man plutonium bomb detonated over the Urukomi Valley. The bomb was more powerful than Hiroshima's, though Nagasaki's hills contained some of the blast. Still, entire neighborhoods vanished. Factories collapsed, burying workers alive. Churches crumbled with worshippers inside. An estimated 40,000 people died instantly. By year's end, 70,000 were dead. Survivor testimonies. The testimonies of Hibakusha, survivors of the atomic bombings, tell the story better than numbers. Shigeko Sasamori, a teenage girl, later described wandering the ruins. I looked at my hands, and the skin was hanging down in strips. My face, my hair, everything was burned. My mother didn't recognize me. Tsutomu Yamaguchi, a man who miraculously survived both Hiroshima and Nagasaki, recalled, "I was surrounded by fire. I thought, this is the end of Japan." Priests in Nagasaki wrote of children crying for parents who would never come. Entire families were erased in seconds. The bombs did not discriminate. Soldiers, civilians, children, the elderly, all were consumed. The aftermath. The days after were worse than the blast itself. Hospitals were destroyed. Doctors were among the dead. Tens of thousands lay untreated, their wounds festering. Radiation sickness, a phenomenon barely understood at the time, began to strike survivors. Hair fell out in clumps. Internal bleeding caused black vomit. Fever burned through weakened bodies. Many who seemed uninjured collapsed days later, never to rise again. Mothers searched among corpses for children. Families dug through rubble with bare hands, hoping to find the living. Few did. By the end of 1945, at least 140,000 people in Hiroshima and 70,000 in Nagasaki were dead. In the years that followed, tens of thousands more would die from cancer and illness linked to radiation exposure. The decision. Back in Washington, the U.S. government framed the bombings as necessary. President Truman announced to the world, "We have used it in order to shorten the agony of war, in order to save the lives of thousands and thousands of young Americans." Invasion planners had feared up to 1 million casualties if Japan had to be taken by land. The bomb, they argued, ended the war in days instead of months. But the morality remained contested, even among Manhattan Project scientists. Some felt vindicated. Their weapon had ended the bloodiest war in history. Others were horrified, believing a demonstration could have sufficed. One scientist later reflected bitterly, "We were told we were saving lives, but in Hiroshima I saw only death." Japan surrenders. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender in a crackling radio broadcast. For most Japanese citizens, it was the first time they had ever heard his voice. The war was over. World War II, the deadliest conflict in human history, ended not with a treaty across a table, but with two flashes of unnatural light that turned cities to ash. A world transformed. For those in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the world ended in fire. For the rest of humanity, it entered a new age, the nuclear age. The Manhattan Project had achieved its goal, but at a price so high it defies comprehension. The survivors, the Hibakusha, carried their scars for life, physical, emotional, generational. Many were shunned in post-war Japan, feared as contaminated. Yet they became living testaments to the horror of nuclear war. One survivor put it simply, "We are the voice of the bomb. If we do not speak, the world will forget." Chapter 7: Pandora's Legacy. The Manhattan Project ended the Second World War, but it also opened a door that can never be closed. For the first time in human history, we had created a weapon powerful enough to end civilization itself. The world after August 1945 was not the same world that existed before July's Trinity test. The men and women who built the bomb knew it. Many felt pride. Others felt horror. Most felt both at once. The bomb was both victory and curse, triumph and tragedy, a paradox born from fear. Oppenheimer's fall. No one embodied this paradox more than Robert Oppenheimer. In 1945, he stood as the father of the atomic bomb, celebrated as a hero. Time magazine put him on its cover. Politicians hailed him as a genius who had ended the war. But in the years that followed, Oppenheimer changed. He spoke publicly of the dangers of nuclear weapons, warning against a global arms race. He argued for international control of atomic energy, believing no nation should hold such destructive power alone. That stance, in the early years of the Cold War, was dangerous. Suspicion swirled around him. His past associations with leftist friends and Communist Party members were dragged into hearings. In 1954, he was stripped of his security clearance. The man who had unleashed the bomb was cast aside by the country he had served. A colleague observed, "In the end, he was destroyed by the very fear he had helped to create." The Cold War shadow. As Oppenheimer fell, the nuclear arms race rose. The Soviet Union, aided by espionage from within the Manhattan Project, detonated its first bomb in 1949. Soon Britain, France, China, and others followed. The genie was out of the bottle. By the 1960s, the United States and the Soviet Union had built arsenals large enough to destroy the world many times over. School children practiced duck-and-cover drills. Cities built fallout shelters. Humanity lived under a permanent shadow, the possibility of annihilation at the push of a button. The bomb had ended one war, but it had also begun an age of perpetual fear. Science and conscience. For scientists, the Manhattan Project became a moral mirror. Could they celebrate their achievement while mourning its consequences? Was the creation of the bomb a victory of knowledge, or a failure of wisdom? Niels Bohr, the great Danish physicist, warned that atomic energy demanded an open world, transparency, cooperation, a shared responsibility. He feared secrecy would only breed rivalry. His warnings went largely unheeded. Enrico Fermi, who had built the first nuclear reactor, later confessed he wished he had never worked on the project. Leo Szilard, who had first urged Roosevelt to pursue the bomb, became one of its loudest critics afterward. Even Oppenheimer himself reflected, in the Council's work, the question of the use of the bomb never arose. It was taken for granted that the bomb would be used. And in the debate on the military use, the voice of the scientist was but one of the voices. The legacy of the Manhattan Project was not only physical, it was ethical. It forced humanity to ask, what does it mean to create something we cannot control? Pandora's box. The myth of Pandora tells of a jar filled with all the world's evils. When Pandora opened it, the evils escaped, leaving only hope inside. The Manhattan Project was its modern echo. Once the bomb existed, it could never be uninvented. Every new weapon built, every arms treaty signed, every moment of tension in the Cold War, all traced back to that morning in New Mexico when the sky lit up with man-made fire. Hope remained, yes. Hope that the bomb's horror would prevent its future use. Hope that deterrence could preserve peace. But hope is fragile, and the jar is already open. A world forever changed. Today, the Manhattan Project is remembered as both a scientific triumph and a moral tragedy. It demonstrated the power of human ingenuity and the peril of human fear. The invisible army of scientists and workers did what seemed impossible. They split the atom, harnessed the stars, and ended the bloodiest war in history. Yet in doing so, they also ensured that humanity would forever live with the possibility of self-destruction. One survivor of Hiroshima once said, "The bomb is not history. It is memory. It lives as long as we remember." Reflection. Perhaps that is the true legacy of the Manhattan Project. Not the mushroom clouds or the arsenals, but the reminder that knowledge is never neutral. Science gives us power. What we choose to do with that power defines us. The project began in fear, fear of Hitler's bomb. It ended in fear, fear of our own. And so the Manhattan Project is not just the story of a weapon. It is the story of humanity confronting its own reflection, brilliant, ambitious, and deeply flawed. The fire lit in the desert of New Mexico still burns in our imagination. It is a warning, a burden, and perhaps, if we listen, a guide. Because once Pandora's box is opened, the only question that remains is what we will do with what has been unleashed. Epilogue. The clock still ticks. The mushroom clouds faded long ago. The ruins of Hiroshima and Nagasaki have been rebuilt into bustling cities. Survivors aged, told their stories, and passed away. But the legacy of the Manhattan Project has never vanished. It lives in stockpiles of warheads, in treaties and summits, in the shadow of a clock that ticks toward midnight. The Doomsday Clock. In 1947, a group of Manhattan Project scientists, haunted by what they had built, created a symbol, the Doomsday Clock. Its hands represent humanity's proximity to self-destruction. Midnight is annihilation. At first, the clock stood at 7 minutes to midnight. Through the Cold War, it ticked forward and backward with each treaty signed, each crisis flared. Today, in the 21st century, it stands closer to midnight than ever before. The bomb is no longer just history. It is present. Survivors' voices. The Hibakusha, survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, spent their lives warning the world. Scarred, often shunned, they spoke with quiet urgency. "Don't let anyone else suffer as we did," they pleaded. Some traveled the globe, testifying at the United Nations, visiting schools, urging leaders to remember. As their numbers dwindle, their voices remain a human echo of fire. The unanswered question. The Manhattan Project showed what humanity can achieve when it harnesses science, will, and fear. But it also revealed the danger of knowledge without wisdom. We can build weapons capable of ending the world. The question is whether we can build the courage to put them aside. The story of the Manhattan Project is not just about the past. It is about the present and the future, because the clock still ticks, and the fire first lit in the desert of New Mexico still waits, silent, in silos across the earth.